Hey everyone, I'm hoping the audio is a bit better today. The last time I did an outdoor video, the wind and general noise around me wasn't very good on the microphone. So I got one of these little clip-on things with a little fluffy on it, which I think helps with the wind. And I'm hoping that improves the audio quality somewhat. Today we're going through the story of the War Within the Webway. Bobbin, leave it. Good boy. Good boy. And, sorry, he was just eating something on the floor. And I'll be going through the story of how the Emperor found the Webway in the first place, the plan to isolate humanity within the Webway, and in doing so, disconnect humanity completely from the risks of the warp, how Magnus ignored the Emperor's instructions, and in doing so, catastrophically destroyed the Webway project. And most interestingly to me, and probably because I knew the least about this particular part of the story, was the Custodies, the Sisters of Silence and others, and their battle within the Webway itself against chaos and traitor Space Marines. And as always, before we start, I'd like to say a quick thank you to our patrons. With all of the monetization issues ongoing with YouTube at the moment, not just myself, but other content creators as well. It's the supporters like you guys that really help keep the content going. So I'd like to say a quick thank you to you. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can find a link in the description below. And as always, if you'd like to listen to audio only, you can find the Lawkeeper's Librarium on Spotify.
The archive had been waiting for him at the bottom of a stairwell that wound downward through the old stone of the Imperial Palace. It was cold down here, and the lights around the archive flickered on as his movement was detected by some unknown motion system. A few of the lumens didn't come on at all, which wasn't surprising. People rarely came down here. The clerk was young. He was a minor functionary of a minor branch of the administratum, tasked with a duty that no one of any real consequence had ever shown the slightest interest in: the cataloguing of personal accounts from the age of the Horus heresy, 10,000 years ago, their contents deemed potentially useful by his seniors, who were studying logistical records from that era, in hopes of identifying lessons that might be applied to present-day supply chain failures across the Imperium. It was the kind of work that sounded significant when described in official requisition forms, and felt considerably less so when one was actually doing it, alone, in a sub-level of the Imperial Palace, where the lumen strips had not been replaced in a long time. He set his things down carefully and without rush. Then he began to set a personal lumen globe, a portable unit that he placed on the edge of the nearest shelf, where it cast a soft golden pool of light across the workstation and made the surrounding darkness feel less like emptiness and more like privacy. The crate before him was unremarkable. Standard administratum storage, dull grey metal, dented at the corners, sealed with a cipher lock, whose code had been included in his briefing documents alongside 17 pages of handling protocols he had skimmed, and a liability waiver he had signed without reading. Inside, as expected, were the materials his seniors had requisitioned: a dense and uninspiring collection of data slates, parchment bundles tied with cord that crumbled a little at his touch, and sheets of old vellum covered in handwriting so faded that reading it required the lumen globe held close enough to warm the page. Supply manifests and casualty tallies were also dispersed throughout. Requisition forms for ammunition and rations and replacement parts for vehicles whose designations he did not recognize. The tedium of 10,000-year-old bureaucracy, preserved with the exacting care the Imperium lavished upon its paperwork and almost never upon its people. He worked through them one by one, logging each item into his own data slate with a patience of someone who has accepted that this is what his day looks like and has made his peace with it. The lumen globe flickered once, and he tapped it gently with his thumb, and it steadied, and the shadows that had leaned in retreated to their proper places. He was 3/4 through the crate when he found the journal. It was not filed. It bore no catalogue number, no acquisition stamp, no administratum seal of any kind. It had simply been there, wedged between a bundle of requisition forms and a water-damaged casualty report, as though it had been swept in by accident, or perhaps placed among records that no one would ever care to examine closely, by someone who wanted it hidden but could not bring themselves to destroy it. It was hand-bound, roughly stitched along the spine with a cord that might have been gut or sinew, its cover made from a material the clerk did not recognize, something that was not quite leather and not quite paper, smooth and faintly warm to the touch in a way that made him pull his hand back for a moment before curiosity drew it forward again. The pages inside were thin and densely covered in handwriting that was cramped and urgent, the letters pressed deep into the surface as though the author had been writing quickly and with great force of feeling. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but remained legible. No name was given, no rank, no unit designation. There was no way of knowing who had written it, or when, or under what circumstances, except that the hand was old, very old, and the words read like the account of someone who had been present for whatever they described, someone who had seen something with their own eyes and needed, for reasons they did not explain, to set it down before it was lost. The clerk read the first few lines, then paused because his hands had begun to tremble slightly. He read a few lines more. The lumen globe hummed softly beside him, and the shadows held their breath, and the sub-level was very quiet. He pulled his robes around his shoulders, and he settled into his chair, and he began to read from the beginning. Before the war, and before all the sorrow that came after, there was a dream. And it was, for a brief time, the most beautiful thing that humanity had ever dared to imagine. Long ago, in the age when Terra itself was still being drawn together under one hand, when the wars of unification still raged across its scarred and ancient surface, the Emperor discovered something buried deep beneath a desert on the continent of Asia. The ruins were impossibly old, sunken so far beneath the earth that the ages themselves seemed to have conspired to hide them. And within those ruins he found a doorway, a portal leading into a vast and secret place that existed between the material universe and the nightmare realm of the warp. Threaded carefully through the space behind reality, like veins of silver running through deep stone. This was the Webway, a labyrinth of tunnels and passages and impossible geometries stretching across the breadth of the galaxy, connecting distant worlds the way forest paths connect villages, except that these paths were shielded from the horrors of the warp by the very substance from which they had been woven. The beings who built them were old, and whatever they called themselves had been lost so thoroughly that even the Eldari, who inherited the labyrinth and made it their own, could not say who had laid its first stones. Beside the portal, the Emperor found a device, a psychic amplifier of extraordinary power, made from a golden alloy that no scholar of the Mechanicum could identify. He spent centuries restoring it, and he directed tens of thousands of tech priests to expand it into the great apparatus that became known as the Golden Throne. And he installed the whole vast complex deep beneath what would become the Imperial Palace, hidden in the roots of the Himalayan mountains. And here is the thing that makes everything that followed so much harder to bear, the detail that turns the later tragedy from something merely terrible into something harder. The Golden Throne was not built to be a prison. It was never meant to hold a dying god in endless suffering. It was a gateway, a device that could open a stable passage from Terra into the Webway and carry humanity through it. And when the Emperor sat upon it and projected his will into the labyrinth, the great golden doors beneath the throne, doors large enough for a Titan to walk through unbowed. Through those doors, the Emperor sent his builders, the Adnector Concilium, they were called, the Unifiers, and they were tens of thousands strong, a new caste of mechanicum workers created for this single purpose, tech priests and bonded laborers and servitors, all of them spending their lives and the lives of their successors across centuries of quiet, devoted work, building humanity's tunnels into the alien labyrinth one corridor at a time. Their tunnels were plain things, functional and industrial, and they looked rather humble, set against the flowing wraithbone of the Eldari sections, where the architecture seemed less built than grown, as if the tunnels themselves were living things that had chosen their own shapes. But the Unifiers built with care and with patience, and though they were never told the full scope of what they were building toward, the secrecy of the project was absolute. They must have sensed, in the way that people who do meaningful work often sense these things, that what they carried in their hands mattered more than they would ever be permitted to know. The trouble and the fatal fragility at the heart of it all was that the Unifiers' tunnels could not protect themselves. The ancient wraithbone corridors generated their own shield against the warp, a quality woven into the very substance of their construction. But the human-built sections had no such gift. They endured only because the Emperor sat upon the golden throne and held a psychic barrier around them, through the sustained effort of his own will. And if that effort ever faltered, everything those tens of thousands of quiet, devoted workers had built across all those long centuries would be laid bare to the warp and all the horrors that dwelled within it. But the dream was worth the risk of it, because the dream was the salvation of mankind. The Emperor saw a future in which humanity traveled the stars without ever touching the warp, safe passage between worlds, instant and shielded, with no need for the mutant navigators who guided ships through nightmare, or the tortured astropaths who burned their minds to send a single whispered message across the void. He saw a future in which, once safely enclosed within the Webway's protective embrace, the species could sever its connection to the warp entirely, starving the dark gods of the sustenance they drew from human suffering and human fear. The Eldari had possessed this same chance and squandered it. They had the Webway, but never broke free of the warp, and their unchecked nature had birthed a god that devoured their civilization whole. The Emperor would not walk that path. And beyond even that, he saw a future in which humanity's slow and unstoppable evolution into a psychic species, a process that, left unguided, would inevitably repeat the Eldari's catastrophe, could be shepherded and shaped within the Webway's safety, until the human race ascended to something greater than even the Eldari had achieved at the height of their glory. Every war he had ever waged, every crusade and conquest and careful decree across millennia of patient work, had been a stepping stone toward this single hidden purpose. And none of his sons knew. Not Horus, who had been entrusted with command of the Great Crusade itself. Not Magnus, the most gifted psyker among the Primarchs, who had almost certainly been created to sit upon the Golden Throne and sustain the Webway in the Emperor's place, so that the Emperor himself could turn his attention to the broader work of guiding humanity's ascension. Not one of them was told, because the Emperor believed that the dream's only protection was silence. And so silence he kept, never seeing, or perhaps never allowing himself to see, that the silence itself was slowly poisoning every bond he had with every one of his children, sowing the very resentment that the enemies of humanity were waiting to exploit. For a time, though, for a fragile, shining, brief span of years, the dream held. The tunnels grew longer, the webway opened wider, and humanity, without knowing it, was closer to salvation than it would ever be again. Then a loyal son tried to save his father, and the dream died in a single night. To understand how the dream died, you must first understand the man who killed it, because he did not mean to, and it is a heartbreaking tragedy. Magnus the Red was not like his brothers. Where the other Primarchs excelled at war or diplomacy, or the grim business of building empires, Magnus was defined by an insatiable love of knowledge, and an extraordinary gift for wielding the strange and terrible power of the warp. He was a giant even among his kind, copper-skinned and crowned with a great mane of fiery red hair, and he possessed only a single eye, for the other had been given up as the price of a bargain. He did not understand at the time, and would not fully understand until it was far too late. When the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy as infants, torn from their father's laboratory by the plans of the dark gods, Magnus came to rest on Prospero, a distant and isolated world inhabited by a small community of outcast scholars and mystics. These were people who had fled persecution elsewhere to build a place where they could study the deeper currents of the universe in peace, and it was perhaps the only world in all the galaxy where a child radiating psychic power would have been welcomed rather than feared. They raised him among books and contemplation, and he surpassed every one of his teachers before he was grown, his vast and restless mind reaching into the warp with a fluency that no human being had ever achieved before. He loved knowledge the way other beings loved conquest or glory. He studied the warp not as a weapon to be aimed, but as an ocean to be charted. And he believed, with the profound confidence of a mind that had never yet encountered a problem it could not solve, that he could navigate its depths safely, that understanding was itself a form of protection. He was brilliant, and he was devoted to his father and to the future of humanity, and both of those qualities would be turned against him by something far older and far more patient. The first thread of the trap was woven around his love for his sons. The 1,000 Sons, Magnus's legion, had been created from his gene seed, and they carried within them the same extraordinary psychic sensitivity. But that gift came twinned with a curse, a horrific affliction called the flesh change, which caused their bodies to warp and twist and degenerate into mindless abominations without warning. Warriors who had been scholars and brothers one moment became shrieking, writhing horrors the next, and their comrades were forced to put them down. The legion was dying, and Magnus, who loved his sons with a fierce tenderness that was unusual even among the Primarchs, could not bear to watch it happen. And so he reached into the warp for answers, as he always did when the world presented him with a problem. And something was waiting for him there, a being of immense power that offered him a cure in exchange for his eye. Magnus did not know what it was. He did not ask. He was desperate, and desperate people do not interrogate the hand that offers them salvation. He accepted, and the flesh change stopped, and for a time it seemed as though his gamble had paid off. It had not. The being was Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the god of sorcery and manipulation, and the cure was not a cure at all, but a leash, a binding that tied Magnus more deeply to the very powers he believed he was mastering. Every act of sorcery that he performed, every reaching into the warp that Magnus and his sons would perform with such confidence and skill, was a step along a path that Tzeentch had laid out. The trap closed years later, and it closed with the accuracy of a thing that had been planned across centuries. Through his forbidden scrying, Magnus witnessed something that shook even him. A vision of Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most trusted and beloved son, falling to the corruption of chaos. Magnus saw the civil war that was about to engulf the Imperium, and he knew with absolute certainty that his father had to be warned. Conventional means of communication were too slow, too fragile for intelligence this critical, and so Magnus, in an act of desperate loyalty, chose to do the one thing the Emperor had expressly forbidden him to do. He gathered the greatest sorcerers of his legion, pulled their psychic power into a single immense working, and projected his consciousness across the breadth of the galaxy toward Terra. His spirit blazed through the warp at impossible speed, and along the way it encountered something he had never expected: a corridor. Not a natural formation of the Immaterium, but a constructed tunnel, walled and shielded and unmistakably artificial, leading toward Terra. He did not know what it was. He had never been told about the Webway, or the Golden Throne's true purpose, or the centuries of secret labor being conducted beneath the palace. He had never been told because the Emperor had told no one. The corridor's psychic wards were immensely strong, the work of the Emperor himself, and even Magnus, amplified by the combined might of his legion's finest, could not breach them. Then a voice spoke to him from within the warp. It was calm and anonymous, and it offered him additional power, the precise amount he needed to break through the barrier and continue his journey. Magnus accepted without hesitation. He was desperate. He was in the grip of the most intense psychic working of his life, and he did not pause to wonder why an unnamed presence in the warp was helping him. At the exact moment he needed help most, the voice was Tzeentch. It had always been Tzeentch. Magnus took the offered power and shattered the wall of the Emperor's Webway. What happened next took only moments, but its consequences would last for 10,000 years. The wards did not just part, they broke in a cascading chain reaction that propagated through the entire network of psychic barriers like fractures spreading through ice. The Golden Throne malfunctioned. The protective sheath that the Emperor had maintained around every meter of human-built tunnel collapsed. Warp rifts tore open throughout the Webway extension. Dozens, then hundreds of wounds in the fabric of reality through which the raw Immaterium came flooding in. And through those wounds came the demons, an endless tide of entities drawn to the sudden exposure of thousands of unprotected human souls. The unifiers, the tens of thousands of quiet, devoted workers who had spent their lives building humanity's road to salvation, died in their thousands. They had no weapons that could harm the things that came for them. They had no defenses. They had been protected by the Emperor's will, and that will had been disrupted. And they were butchered in the tunnels they had built with their own hands. And then Magnus's spirit, a blazing colossus of psychic fire, burst through the ruined portal and materialized in the throne room beneath the Himalaysian mountains, standing before his father and the Golden Throne. In that single instant of contact between the two most powerful psychic minds in human history, the Emperor showed Magnus everything. Not merely anger, though his fury was terrible. He showed him the Webway, the tunnels, the centuries of secret work, the three-phase plan for humanity's salvation. He showed him the demons flooding the corridors and the workers dying in their thousands, and the future that had just been extinguished. And he showed Magnus, at last, the role he had been created to play, that his extraordinary psychic gift was not an accident of birth, but a design, that he had been built to sit upon the Golden Throne and sustain the Webway, while the Emperor guided humanity towards something greater. The son who was never told his purpose had just destroyed the thing he was made to serve. Magnus was so shattered by the weight of that understanding that he could not even speak the warning that had driven him to this act in the first place. The intelligence about Horus died unspoken on the lips of a Primarch, too devastated by what he had done to say the words. His spirit retreated to Prospero in silence and shame, leaving behind a malfunctioning throne, a ruined project, an enraged father, and a Webway filled with nightmares. And on Prospero, as Magnus's consciousness settled back into his body, the architect of fate revealed himself at last, dropping the mask of the anonymous voice in the warp and showing Magnus exactly what had been done to him and through him. The entity that had offered the cure for the flesh change. The entity whose demons had disguised themselves as the Legion's trusted familiar spirits. The entity that had whispered in the dark and offered power at the precise moment it was needed most. All of it had been the same being, patient and amused, weaving every thread of Magnus's life into a single tapestry of ruin. The most brilliant of the Emperor's sons, the one who prided himself above all else on his understanding of the universe's deepest mysteries, had been the most thoroughly and completely deceived, and he had never once suspected it. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, and he did not rise again. Not because the dream could be saved. The dream was already dead, shattered beyond any hope of mending in the moments after Magnus's breach. He sat because if he did not, the demons pouring through the rifts in the Webway would reach the portal beneath the palace, and from there they would flood into the Imperial dungeon, and from there onto the surface of Terra itself, and there would be nothing left. The gateway that had been built to carry humanity toward transcendence now had to be held shut by the same mind that had opened it, and holding it shut required every scrap of the Emperor's attention, every fiber of his psychic will, every waking moment of every day, for what would prove to be 5 unbroken years. The throne became his prison. The most powerful being in human history, the architect of empires and conqueror of worlds, the mind that had guided humanity's ascent across millennia, chained to a chair in a dark chamber beneath a mountain, unable to rise, unable to command his armies, unable to respond to the galaxy-wide civil war that was erupting around him. The Horus heresy, the most consequential conflict in the history of the species, would be fought without the Emperor's hand leading it. That burden fell to 3 men, Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's oldest and most trusted advisor, a psyker of formidable ability and a statesman of extraordinary cunning, took command of the Imperium's day-to-day war effort. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the great fortifier whose stubborn and unyielding nature made him the most dependable of the Emperor's remaining loyal sons, assumed military command of Terra's defense, and Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, the greatest single warrior in the Imperium, coordinated the Emperor's personal forces. 3 men, a bureaucrat, a builder, and a soldier, left to fight a war that spanned the galaxy while their master sat in the dark and held a door. Into the Webway itself, the Emperor sent the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. The Custodian Guard, the 10,000, the Emperor's personal guard, each one a masterwork of genetic craft, who had walked the inner sanctums of the palace since the days of unification, descended through the portal in their golden warplate. Alongside them went the Sisters of Silence, the Witch-Bane Sisterhood, women who carried the pariah gene and whose very presence was poison to the creatures of the warp. These were the only military forces permitted to walk freely within the innermost chambers of the Imperial Palace, and now they were being sent into alien tunnels to fight an enemy that had no end. The Mechanicum followed, under the overall command of Fabricator General Zagreus Kane, an exiled loyalist whose body had been so extensively augmented that little of the man he had once been remained visible. Thousands of Skitarii soldiers, combat servitors, and Ordo Reductor siege specialists marched through the Golden Doors, and with them came the God Engines. The Legio Ignatum, the Fire Wasps, committed a full maniple of Titans to the Webway, and the logistics of that commitment alone show the desperation of the defense. The Warlord Titan Scion of Vigilant Light, the most powerful single weapon the defenders would possess, was too large to walk through the portal standing upright. And so the entire God Engine, a war machine the size of a cathedral, bristling with weapons capable of leveling cities, was completely disassembled on the surface of Terra, carried through the Webway gate piece by piece, and painstakingly rebuilt on the other side. But the most extraordinary engine committed to the Webway was something stranger and more terrible than any conventional Titan. The Ordo Sinister, the Emperor's secret Titan formation, answering directly to the Master of Mankind, and deployed under authorities forbidden to all others, including the Primarchs. This Ordo sent the Psi-Titan Borealis Thune into the tunnels. It was a Warlord-class chassis, vast and terrible, but it had been rebuilt from the inside out around a device called the Siricrux Anima, a psychic amplification matrix designed by the Emperor himself, using knowledge drawn from the forbidden technologies of the Dark Age. Where a conventional Titan was crewed by a princeps neurally bonded to the machine's spirit, Borealis Thune was piloted by a preceptor intendant, a psychic blank, one of those rare and unsettling souls who cast no shadow in the warp, seated within a shielded crucible of geometric arrays of gold, silver, lead, jade, and bone, and slaved around that null pilot, bound into the machine's architecture like instruments in an organ, were caged alpha-grade psychos, whose powers and life forces were siphoned through the Siricrux Anima to fuel weaponry. Its primary weapon, the Left Hand of Darkness, was a psi cannon that tore open breaches in reality and hurled its targets into the warp molecule by molecule. The engine projected fields of supernatural terror, drained life, and could even reverse damage through localized distortions of time. A single Psi-Titan could hold an entire sector of the Webway against demonic incursion. And fewer of these engines existed than there had ever been Primarchs. Of 25 Warlord chassis originally tithed for conversion, only 20 had survived the process. They were among the rarest and most terrible weapons in the Imperium's arsenal, and one of them now walked the alien dark in defense of a dream that was already lost. The Imperial forces established themselves around Kalistar, the impossible city, and it is worth pausing here to say something about that place, because it was unlike anything the defenders had ever seen, and its strangeness stayed with those who survived long after the war was over. Kalistar was an ancient Eldari city and one of the principal hubs of the Webway, located relatively close to Terra within the labyrinth. It had been abandoned before the fall of the Eldari, its inhabitants apparently foreseeing the catastrophe and departing before the birth scream of the god that would consume their civilization. When the Imperials found it, it had been empty for millennia, and yet the wraithbone structures remained in pristine condition. The city existed in every direction. Buildings and towers and winding pathways occupied every surface, the ground, the walls, the ceiling, with gravity functioning equally in all of them, so that to look directly up was to see more districts and more spires kilometers distant, reaching downward just as the spires on the ground reached up. There was no true ground, there was no true sky, there was only wraithbone in every direction, shrouded in a perpetual haze of mist that none of the Mechanicum's instruments could explain. The chasm beneath the city's bridges was measured by the tech priests, and determined to be so deep that a body falling into it would die of old age before reaching the bottom. The Imperials made it their fortress, grafting crude Imperial barricades and gun platforms onto the ancient wraithbone like iron bandages on a porcelain statue. And from the Godspire, the tallest of the city's spires, its approach lined with statues of Eldari gods that no human could name. The commanders of the defense directed the war. And a pattern emerged in those early months that offered something almost like hope. The custodians established blockades across the Webway tunnels, fortified positions at every natural choke point, turning the labyrinth's own geography into a series of killing grounds. At the blockade line, the Golden Warriors held their positions, forming walls of auramite armor and consecrated blade that the demons crashed against in wave after futile wave. Forward of the line, small strike forces of custodians and sisters launched rapid counterattacks into the tunnels, hitting demonic concentrations before they could mass for an overwhelming assault, and withdrawing before the enemy could respond in force. And behind the defensive line, the surviving Mechanicum workers did the quiet, essential work of sealing warp rifts and repairing damaged tunnel sections, cutting off the flow of new demons into areas already secured. It was a strategy of patient, grinding reclamation. Close every breach, hold every meter, push the line forward as each section was made safe. And at the heart of it was the partnership that made it all possible. The Custodes and the Sisters of Silence had been designed to fight as two halves of a single perfect weapon, the talons of the Emperor. Every sister's null aura weakened and destabilized the demons at a fundamental level, thinning their hold on physical reality, causing them pain merely by her proximity. And a demon slain within the radius of that null field risked something far worse than the usual banishment back to the warp. It risked something approaching a true death, an unraveling so complete that even an immortal Neverborn might not recover from it. The prospect terrified the demons in a way that blades and bullets alone never could, and the custodians, supreme warriors of purely physical mastery, exploited that terror without mercy. The line held, the rifts were sealed one by one. The blockades advanced, slowly but steadily, and for a brief and fragile time, the war within the Webway felt as though it could be won. It could not. But for a little while, in those early months, it was possible to believe otherwise, and perhaps that made the fighting easier to bear. For a while, as we have said, the war felt as though it could be won, and then, gradually and then, all at once, it couldn't. The first warning came from the defender's own command. The tribunate, the senior group of custodian officers who stood directly below the Captain General, perhaps 10 warriors in all, each one holding the extraordinary privilege of counseling the Emperor himself, began to die. Tribune Helios, who had commanded the war's opening phase with steady hands and a tactician's mind, was killed in action. It is a simple thing to write, and it was not a simple thing to bear, because tribunes were not supposed to fall. These were not common soldiers. They were the finest of a brotherhood that was itself the finest fighting force humanity had ever produced, and the Webway had taken one of them. Command passed to Tribune Gesaric. He was one of the original 30, one of the very first custodians the Emperor had created with his own hands, back in the earliest days of the Unification Wars, when the Imperium was still being hammered into shape on the anvil of a single world. He had fought at the Battle of Morlan Sen. He carried within himself a living memory of the Emperor's first steps toward unity, And now here he was, commanding a desperate war in alien tunnels to protect the last remnants of his master's greatest ambition. But the enemy was changing. The initial waves had been demons in their various forms, the Neverborn, creatures of nightmare and malice given shape by the warp. Against these, the Custodes and Sisters of Silence had been devastatingly effective. The partnership between Golden Blade and Null Aura had held the blockades, sealed the tunnels, and pushed the line slowly forward. But now greater demons began appearing among the hordes, bloodthirsters and things of comparable power, creatures of such immense and concentrated fury that a single one could tear through an entire Imperial formation before enough force could be marshaled to bring it down. Each one demanded the attention of the best the defenders had, and while those warriors were occupied, the lesser hordes pressed the blockades harder, and the cracks began to show. There is one story from this time that should be told, because it says something important about the kind of people who fought this war. A bloodthirster, a great demon of the blood god, broke through the Imperial lines and fought its way down the tunnels until it reached the approaches to the Golden Throne itself, the last threshold before Terra. And standing in its path, alone, was a Sister of Silence named Celia Heroda. She did not run. She did not call for aid that could not have reached her in time. She stood, and her Null Aura reached out and weakened the thing, destabilized its grip on reality. And she fought it, and she killed it. And then she died, not from any wound the demon had inflicted, but from the simple, total exhaustion of the effort. She had poured everything she was into stopping that one creature, and when it was done, there was nothing left of her to go on living with. And then, the nature of the enemy changed again, and this time the change went to the very foundations of how the war was being fought. Traitor Space Marines entered the Webway, word-bearers and world-eaters, corrupted sons of the Emperor who had found their way into the labyrinth through breaches opened by the Chaos Gods, and they brought with them something the demonic hordes had never possessed, the ability to think. Tactical intelligence, coordinated maneuver, ranged firepower delivered with the skill of warriors who had spent decades mastering the art of war, and worst of all, a physical resilience that owed nothing to the warp, which meant that the Sisters of Silence, whose Null Auras had been the single greatest weapon in the Imperial arsenal, found their gift blunted against enemies of mortal flesh. A demon withered in a sister's presence. A world-eater simply did not care. With the traitor Astartes came their engines of war. Corrupted armor columns added grinding conventional firepower to a conflict that had been fought until now with blade and psychic flame. And then came something worse. Traitor Titans. The Legio Audax, the Ember Wolves, bonded to the World-Eater's Legion, deployed their wolf packs of Warhound Scout Titans, armed with the terrible Ursus claws, enormous barbed harpoons on heavy chains, designed to impale larger god engines and drag them down the way a pack of wolves brings down prey, too vast for any single hunter. And striding among them came the warlord Titan, Lexarak, a cathedral of corrupted metal, escorted by the warhound daughter of the Red Star. The tunnels that had echoed with the clash of blade on demonic flesh now shook with the footfalls of engines, turned to the service of darkness. Jasseric fell. One of the original 30, a man who remembered the Emperor's earliest days, gone into the dark of the tunnels and never coming back. And 2 weeks after his death, 2 weeks, barely time to grieve, barely time to draw breath, Tribune Kadai Vilakan was killed, and his death carried a particular sting because it did not have to happen. Against the council of Tribune Ra Endymion and Knight Commander Genetia Kroll, Vilakan had pushed deep into the tunnels beyond Kalistar, trusting calculations from the Mechanicum that promised a decisive victory over the Chaos forces in that sector. The calculations were wrong. The advance became a disaster. Vilakan died because he trusted the wrong numbers, and the grief of it was sharpened by the knowledge that the people who knew the war best had told him not to go, and he had gone anyway. And that left Ra Endymion remaining, one tribune, one man carrying the weight of a command that had once been shared among 10, leading the shattered remnants of a force that had lost 9 of every 10 warriors it had started with. The 10,000 had become something far less, and every golden warrior who fell was a loss that could never be replaced, not merely because of what it cost to create a single custodian, but because each one was a person, with a name and a history and centuries of service. And when they died, all of that went with them into the dark. That was the truth of this war, and it was a truth that admitted no comfort. The enemy was infinite, the defenders were not, and the tunnels took and took and took and gave nothing back. And then something came into the Webway that was older than the Chaos Gods, and stranger, and in its own way more terrible than anything the defenders had yet faced. Its name was Drach'nyan, the end of empires, the echo of the first murder, the thorn in reality. And the sound of that name, if you could hear it truly, was an approximation of 2 screams layered one atop the other. The scream of the first human being who ever took the life of another outside the need for survival, and the scream of the one who died beneath his hands. That is what Drach'nyan was. It was born in that moment, the very first instant in which a human being killed not for food, not for safety, not because survival demanded it, but simply because they chose to, because they wanted something that another person had, or because rage overcame them, or because the dark voice in the back of their mind whispered that it would be easier this way. In that single act, something was born in the warp that had never existed before, and it had been growing ever since, fed by every murder committed across the breadth of the human species, for as long as humans had drawn breath. Drach'nyan was bound to no god. It owed no allegiance to Khorne or Tzeentch or any of the ruinous powers. It was older than their interest in humanity, and powerful enough to exist entirely on its own terms, an independent entity sustained by the sheer, endless, inexhaustible tide of human violence. Every killing, every word of hatred spoken in the ears of the dying, every thought of murder entertained and acted upon across 1,000,000 worlds and 100 centuries, all of it fed the thing that now walked the tunnels beneath Terra. The Emperor, seated upon the golden throne, sensed it the moment it manifested. He knew what it was. He understood, perhaps better than any other being alive, what Drach'nyan represented and what it was capable of. And he tasked the Custodes and Sisters of Silence to find it and destroy it. They tried. In the Webway, Drach'nyan could be wounded by mortal weapons, in ways that it could not in the pure warp. The Custodes hurt it, and it retreated, and for a brief moment it might have seemed that even this ancient horror could be brought to heel by sufficient application of force. It could not. Drach'nyan simply changed its approach. After the first assault came something worse, because it was personal. Drach'nyan did not lead charges or command armies. It stalked. It shifted forms constantly, now a virus threading through the tunnels, now a vast and incomprehensible beast, now something so alien that it was hard to even know what you were looking at. It moved through the Imperial defenses like a needle through cloth, picking the stitches apart one by one. It targeted individual custodians. It killed them, and then it wore their bodies like puppets, turning the golden dead against their living brothers. Warriors who had trained together for centuries, who knew each other's movements the way a musician knows a familiar song, suddenly facing those same movements directed by something wearing their fallen brother's face. The demon puppeted their corpses mockingly, using their own fighting styles, their own weapons, their own beloved and hard-won skills, to kill the people who had loved them. It was a cruelty that went beyond the physical, a violation that struck at something deeper than flesh, and the psychological toll it took on the defenders was immense. But Drach'nyan's most devastating act was not one of direct violence. It was something more cunning and far more costly. The demon found Princeps Enker Morova, the commander of the Reaver Titan Black Sky, one of the Legio Ignatum's god engines, still fighting in the Webway. Morova was neurally bonded to his Titan through the Mind Impulse unit, a direct link between his consciousness and the machine's systems, and that link was a doorway. Drach'nyan entered through it. The demon invaded Morova's mind, consumed his will, forced him to murder both of his own crew, the Moderati who sat beside him, who trusted him, who had no warning and no defense, and then took sole command of the Reaver's weapon systems. The possessed Black Sky still bore the colors of the Legio Ignatum. It still looked, from the outside, like a loyalist engine. And then the traitor warlord Lexarak and its escort, the warhound daughter of the Red Star, opened fire on the Black Sky because it wore loyalist markings, because it appeared to be an enemy. The scion of Vigilant Light, the most powerful loyalist titan in the Webway, the great warlord that had been carried through the portal in pieces and painstakingly reassembled in the alien dark, saw what appeared to be a friendly engine under attack by traitor forces, and did what any loyal warrior would do. It intervened. It turned its immense firepower on the traitor titans, destroyed both Lexarak and the daughter of the Red Star, and saved the Black Sky from destruction. It saved the demon. It rescued the very thing that would kill it. The scion of Vigilant Light was crippled from the engagement, its systems stressed, and its ammunition depleted by the effort of destroying two enemy titans. And the possessed Black Sky, freed from its attackers by the loyalty and courage of its own ally, turned its guns on the scion and tore it apart. The most powerful loyalist titan in the Webway, the engine that had been disassembled and rebuilt with such painstaking care, the single greatest conventional weapon the defenders possessed, was killed by the engine it had just saved, through an act of loyalty that the demon had turned into the instrument of destruction. In one stroke, Imperial Titan superiority in the Webway was erased, not by superior force, not by overwhelming numbers, by a single demon that had found the gap between trust and treachery, and threaded itself through it with the patience of something that had been perfecting the art of murder since humanity's first breath. Drach'nyan could not be killed. It could not be bargained with, or reasoned with, or contained by any weapon the defenders possessed. It could only be endured, a constant stalking, shape-shifting presence in the tunnels, always watching, always waiting, always finding the one weakness in any defense and exploiting it. The war had been hard before Drach'nyan came. After its arrival, it became seemingly impossible. When things grew truly desperate, when Drach'nyan stalked the tunnels and the tribunate had been bled down to a single man, and the defenders could count their remaining strength and see the end written in the numbers, Custodian Prefect Diocletian Koros was sent to the surface to find help. He climbed out of the Webway and into a world that had its own nightmares to contend with. Terra was a planet bracing for siege. The Horus heresy had consumed the Imperium's resources so thoroughly that there was almost nothing left to give, and the Webway project's absolute secrecy meant that Diocletian could not explain to anyone what he needed reinforcements for, or why, or what was at stake. He could not tell them that beneath the palace the emperor sat imprisoned on a golden chair, holding shut a door that led to hell. He could not tell them that the finest warriors in the Imperium were dying by the 100 in tunnels no one knew existed. He could only ask and take whatever was offered, and know that it would not be enough. What he found was this: House Viridian, a family of Imperial knights who had been sitting in a prison cell, awaiting execution for a crime that was not entirely their own. They had served under Primarch Fulgrim in good faith during the Great Crusade, sworn to the Emperor's children for 3 generations. And when the heresy came, they had followed Fulgrim's call to war, without knowing he had fallen to chaos. By the time they understood the truth, they had already fought on the wrong side. They had broken with the traitors the moment the evidence became undeniable, had refused Fulgrim's final orders, and had travelled all the way to Terra to beg forgiveness. For their trouble, they were imprisoned and then forgotten, left to rot in a cell where even their meal servitors malfunction, while the Emperor's children burned their homeworld, their families, and their ancestral knight suits in retaliation. They were condemned, and they knew it, and Diocletian offered them the only thing he could: a chance to die with meaning on a battlefield no one would ever hear about, in service to an emperor who might never know their names. They accepted. They painted their borrowed, mismatched armor in the atonement colors of black and gold, and they went into the dark. Then there was Zephon, Dominion Zephon, called the Bringer of Sorrow, a blood angel, one of the sons of Sanguinius. Before his injuries he had been a harpist, a musician of genuine skill, because the blood angels were that rarest and most beautiful of contradictions. Angels of death who also cherished art and music and the making of lovely things. An alien blade had taken both his arms below the elbow, ruined his leg, and destroyed his ability to play the instrument he loved. 9 surgeries had failed to make his augmetic replacements work properly. His metal fingers shuddered and misfired. He could pull the trigger of a bolt gun, roughly 1 time in 5. He had been left on Terra as effectively broken, a warrior who could no longer fight, and an artist who could no longer create, marooned in a war he could not contribute to, pleading again and again to be allowed to search for his missing legion, and being denied every time. Diocletian took him anyway, and in the tunnels, the brilliant and insufferably arrogant techno-archaeologist Arkan Land, the man who had rediscovered the Land Raider and the Land Speeder, accompanied everywhere by his beloved cybernetic monkey Sapien, befriended the broken Blood Angel, and, through sheer unorthodox genius, temporarily repaired his augmetics. For a little while, Zephon could fight again. For a little while, his hands worked. And there was the Archimandrite, and of all the figures who entered the Webway in this final wave of reinforcements, this one may be the saddest. The Archimandrite was a war construct, a towering mechanical chassis bristling with weapons, clawed and armored and terrible. But inside it, wired into its systems, her living brain fused permanently with the machine, was Hieronyma. Magos Domina, Hieronyma of the Ordo Reductor, who had been a person before she was a weapon, and who had chosen to have her vocal cords removed before the surgery that sealed her inside the machine, not because she was brave, but because she did not want to embarrass herself by screaming while they did it. That detail tells you everything about the kind of people the Imperium sends to war. Not heroes from legend, people who are afraid and go anyway, and who make small private arrangements with their own dignity before they walk into the dark. These were the last reinforcements the War Within the Webway would ever receive. The condemned, the broken, and the barely loyal prisoners in borrowed armor, a crippled angel with hands that didn't work, and a woman sealed inside a machine who had cut out her own voice before they put her in. No legions, no fleets, no Primarchs riding to the rescue, just the people no one else wanted, given a chance to matter one last time. They went into the tunnels, and they fought. Kalistar fell the way all great fortresses fall, not in a single decisive blow, but in a series of wounds that bled faster than they could be stitched, until the defenders looked around and realized that what they were holding was no longer a fortress, but a ruin. And the only question left was how many of them would make it out alive. The walls came down first. The Legio Audax, vicious warhound wolf packs bonded to the World Eaters, drove their titans directly into Kalistar's Wraithbone fortifications and detonated their plasma reactors against the walls in suicidal charges. These were not acts of desperation from the traitors' perspective. They were calculated sacrifices, god engines given willingly to the fire so that their deaths might crack open the impossible city like a shell. The Wraithbone, which had stood pristine and unblemished for millennia since the Eldari abandoned it, shattered under the fury of reactor detonations that burned brighter than stars. And through those breaches, the full combined might of chaos came flooding in. By this point, the defenders had no titans left to answer them. Every loyalist engine was destroyed or so badly damaged it could no longer fight. The scion of Vigilant Light was gone. The warhounds Ascraeus and Ilmarius Novus had already fallen. There was nothing left that could meet a god engine on equal terms, and so the custodians and sisters met the breach with what they had always relied upon: their own bodies, their own blades, and the stubborn, unyielding refusal to take a single step backward that did not have to be taken. The fighting inside Kalistar raged for weeks without respite. Tribune Ra Endymion, the last tribune, the sole surviving commander of a force that had once numbered 10,000, fought for 17 consecutive days without stopping. 17 days of unbroken combat against an enemy that came in waves that never ended, in a city where gravity meant nothing and the enemy could attack from any direction. He fought until his body simply refused to carry him any further, and he collapsed, and then he rested for what could not have been long enough, and then he got up and fought again. He was not alone in this. The custodians around him fought with severe injuries, and I mention them not for the spectacle of it, but because there is something in those details that speaks to the depth of what these warriors were willing to endure. They fought with half their heads destroyed. They fought with their faces dissolved by demonic venom. They fought with limbs severed, with ruined bodies held together by nothing but will and the genetic mastery of the Emperor's craft. Custodians who by any reasonable measure should have been dead continued to swing their blades and hold their positions and refuse to fall, because falling meant the line broke, and the line could not break, because behind the line was the gate to Terra. And then, in the middle of all this, came the betrayal. The Archimandrite, the towering war construct that had once been Hieronyma, the woman who had cut out her own voice before they sealed her inside the machine, ordered a general retreat of all Mechanicum forces. Not a retreat to regroup, a retreat to abandon the custodians entirely. The Mechanicum contingent would seek the Arisian path, an ancient webway route leading all the way to Mars, and leave the Golden Warriors and the Sisters of Silence to die alone in the ruins of Kalistar. Institutional loyalty to the Red Planet, to the sacred homeland of the Omnissiah's servants, overrode loyalty to the broader Imperium and the people bleeding beside them. For the custodians who had been counting on Mechanicum firepower and Skitarii support, who were already stretched beyond breaking, The withdrawal mid-battle was a knife in the back at the worst possible moment. The treachery did not save its author. Drach'nyan, that patient and ancient horror, sensed the Archimandrite and found what it had been looking for. A host. The construct was a weapon of immense power, but it was still controlled by a living human brain. And a living brain was a door that Drach'nyan could open. There was a moment, brief and unbearably sad, when Hieronyma herself resurfaced, a flicker of the woman she had been, her own consciousness rising through the machine systems for one last instant of awareness before the demon consumed her utterly. Then Drach'nyan wore her body the way it wore everything, and the Archimandrite became a thing of nightmare. The possessed construct rampaged through the retreating Imperial forces. It annihilated Sisters of Silence with weapons designed for siege warfare. It crushed an Imperial Knight and the pilot within. And it destroyed Sagittarius Malak, a Contemptor dreadnought who had been one of the original 30 custodians, the very first of his kind to be interred in a walking tomb when his body failed, bearing the words carved upon his sarcophagus by the Emperor's own hand. One of the oldest warriors in the Imperium, entombed in sacred iron, destroyed by a demon, wearing the body of an ally. It was Zephon who stopped it, the broken blood angel, the bringer of sorrow, whose borrowed hands were already beginning to fail as Arkan Land's temporary repairs degraded. Zephon threw himself at the possessed Archimandrite and detonated a bandolier of crack grenades against its chassis, blowing the demon's host apart through the simple expedient of being close enough to the explosion that he could not miss. He saved the life of Baroness Jaya de Arcus of House Viridian, one final act of heroism from a warrior at the end of his service. Drach'nyan, as it always did, shed its broken host and retreated into the dark, patient and indestructible, to wait for the next opportunity. Kalistar was lost. The impossible city, which had been the heart of the Imperial defense for 5 grinding years, was abandoned, and the retreat became a thing of desperate running violence through the Webway tunnels. House Viridian held the rearguard, those condemned knights in their borrowed mismatched armor, painted in the atonement colors of black and gold, fighting the final battle of redemption they had been promised when Diocletian pulled them from their cells. They held the line so that the Custodes and Sisters could fall back, and they held it knowing that no one would ever know what they did here. The Chaos forces drove the retreating Imperials all the way back through the tunnels to the Webway Gate itself, the golden doors beneath the Imperial Palace, the last threshold between the alien dark and the soil of Terra. There was nowhere left to retreat to. Behind them was the gate. Beyond the gate was the Emperor. And beyond the Emperor, there was nothing. The next part of the story is the hardest part to tell, and it must be told carefully, because it is not just a moment in a war. It is the moment that defined the next 10,000 years. The Emperor had a contingency. He had known from the beginning that there might come a day when he needed to leave the Golden Throne, needed to stand and fight in person, and that the throne could not be left unattended, because the moment his psychic will cease to flow through its circuits, the demons would pour through the portal, and Terra would die. And so, quietly, in the shadows behind the war, he had given the Sisters of Silence a charge. The black ships, the fleet that gathered psychers from across the galaxy as the Great Tithe, had been working at a desperate, hurried pace, collecting souls for a purpose that only the Emperor and a handful of his most trusted servants understood. The unspoken sanction. 1,000 psychers, captured and coffined, sacrificed to the arcane mechanisms of the Golden Throne to power it without the Emperor's presence for a single solar day. Their psychic essence would be burned as fuel, drained, consumed, extinguished, to hold the gate shut while the Emperor rose and entered the Webway in person. One day, 1,000 lives, that was the exchange. Caria Kazrin, the Oblivion Knight who had fought beside Diocletian through years of horror, who had seen things in those tunnels that no human mind should have to carry, was given the task of installing the first coffin. The unspoken sanction was designed as an emergency measure, a one-time act of terrible necessity, born from desperation, enacted because the alternative was the death of Terra and every soul upon it. It was never meant to be repeated, but it was repeated. It was repeated every single day for the next 10,000 years. When the Emperor returned to the throne and sealed the Webway gate forever, the mechanism that had been improvised in crisis became the foundation of the Imperium's survival. The Astronomicon is powered by the sacrifice of psychers fed to the Golden Throne. Every day, 1,000 souls a day, burning and dying in the same coffins that Caria Kazrin installed with her own hands beneath the palace, sustaining a light in the darkness that was never supposed to be lit this way. And after 5 years of imprisonment, 5 years of sitting motionless in the dark while his finest warriors bled and died in the tunnels beyond the gate, 5 years of holding the door shut through nothing but the sustained agony of his own will, the Emperor of mankind rose from the Golden Throne. He had one day, 1,000 souls had bought him that much, and he walked through the golden doors into the Webway to finish what his servants had been dying for, and to say goodbye to the dream that had brought them all here. The Chaos forces had reached the gate, after years of blockades and retreats, of grinding attrition and desperate last stands in alien tunnels. The enemy had finally arrived at the one place they could never be allowed to reach, the golden doors beneath the Imperial Palace, the threshold between the Webway and Terra. The surviving custodians and sisters of silence formed their final line before the portal, with the resignation of people who had run out of places to stand. And then the doors opened behind them, and the sun rose in a realm that had never known sunlight. The Emperor came through the gate as a burning dawn, not a figure walking calmly into battle, but a blaze of golden psychic fire, so immense and so radiant that it flooded the structure of the Webway itself, pouring into the Wraithbone and the tunnels and the alien architecture, as though the very walls were being lit from within. After 5 years of sitting motionless in the dark, holding the door shut through nothing but the sustained agony of his will, he rose and he burned, and the light of him was the most terrible and most beautiful thing that anyone in those tunnels had ever seen. The custodians felt something change in the air the moment he appeared. It was not just morale, though that alone would have been enough. It was something deeper, something physical, as though the Emperor's presence reached into their battered bodies and reminded them what they were. For 5 years they had fought alone, the finest warriors in the Imperium, grinding themselves down against an enemy that never stopped coming. But bearing it and fighting alongside the being they had been created to serve were different things, and the difference was visible in every blade stroke and every step forward. Their master fought beside them. After everything, after all the years and all the dead, he was here. And then he called the dead. Golden light gathered in the tunnels, not the blazing fire of the Emperor's own power, but something softer, something that pulsed with a warmth that had no business existing in a place like this. Spectral figures took shape in the glow, one after another, wreathed in psychic flame, their shapes indistinct but unmistakable. The spirits of every custodian who had died in the 5-year war. Every golden warrior who had fallen holding a blockade, or leading a counterattack, or standing alone against something that should have killed them, and did. They were all there, returned, blazing with the light of the Father they had died serving. And among them came others, figures bearing the insignia of legions, that had been betrayed and slaughtered at Istvan V, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, loyal sons murdered by their own brothers in the heresy's most infamous massacre, now given form again in the Emperor's immolating wrath. The betrayed dead who had died not in glorious battle, but in treachery, who had been lured to a killing field by brothers they trusted and gunned down in their thousands. They walked again, burning and furious, and the tunnels rang with the footsteps of an army that had already died once and had come back to fight one more time. And at the heart of that host, towering above even the other spectres, strode a giant among giants, a figure of immense stature with great hands bared, wreathed in golden fire that burned brighter than all the rest, the 10th son of a dying empire, briefly reborn in his father's immolating wrath. A Primarch whose head had been taken from his shoulders by a brother's blade at Istvan, returned now as a blazing avatar of everything that had been stolen from the Imperium on that day. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone was a statement that the dead remembered, and the dead were angry, and the dead had come home. The demons screamed. They screamed, and they burned, and they died. Truly died, unraveled by the Emperor's psychic fire. The golden host tore through the demon ranks like a sunrise burning away fog, and for the first time in 5 years, the tunnels belonged to the Imperium. Again, if only for a moment, if only for this single borrowed day. And then Drach'nyan came forward. The demon had been waiting. It had been waiting, perhaps, since the moment of its birth. It manifested now in the form it had worn at the very beginning. A Stone Age warchief, wrapped in furs, bearing jewelry of bone and a spear of napped flint. A primitive figure, almost absurdly simple, against the blinding radiance of the Emperor's golden host. It looked up at the master of mankind with something that might have been recognition, or kinship, or hunger. It said, "I am your end." 5 long talons pierced the Emperor's golden armor. The master of mankind bled. Perhaps for the first time in his long existence, he experienced the alien sensation of his own blood leaving his body. The demon's claws were buried in his flesh, and for one terrible instant, the two of them were locked together. The salvation and the damnation of the human species, face to face, in a sunless tunnel, at the end of a war that had already destroyed everything worth saving. Then the Emperor seized Drach'nyan with both hands. Golden radiance blazed so fiercely that even the custodians could not look directly at it, and in that light the demon's form twisted and compressed and screamed. Forced against its will into a new shape, a fine, elegant sword whose surface crawled with hundreds of tiny mouths that opened and closed hungrily, lapping at the divine blood that ran from the Emperor's wounds. The end of empires, the echo of the first murder, reduced to a blade, not destroyed because it could never be destroyed, but contained, imprisoned in a shape that could be held and carried and kept away from the world it was born to ruin. And through all of this, the blazing dawn, the golden dead, the battle with the demon, the Sisters of Silence saw none of it. That is the cruelest gift of the pariah gene. The null aura that made the Sisters so devastating against demons also blinded them to the Emperor's psychic radiance. Where the custodians saw a god wreathed in golden fire, the Sisters saw something else. Carrier Kazrin, who had fought this war from the beginning, who had installed the coffins and borne the weight of the unspoken sanction, who had given more of herself to this cause than any accounting could measure, Caria looked at the Emperor and saw a man. The Emperor pulled the demon sword from his own body and called Ra Endymion forward. Throughout Ra's life, the Emperor had shared visions with him, glimpses of his own existence stretching back to the dawn of humanity, memories of ages and empires, and the long, patient work of guiding a species towards something better. Ra had always believed these visions were a gift of knowledge, a teacher sharing wisdom with a trusted student so that the student might fight harder, serve more faithfully, understand more deeply what he was protecting. And they were all of those things, but they were also something else. They were preparation, not for the war, not for the fighting, for this single moment, standing in a burning tunnel at the end of everything, about to be asked to carry a burden that no other soul in the Imperium could bear. The Emperor drove the demon blade into Ra's body. He did it carefully, placing the sword so that it slid between organs, avoiding anything vital, because Ra needed to live. Ra needed to live for a very long time, because the demon sealed within the blade would rage and tear at him from the inside for as long as he drew breath. And every step Ra took away from Terra was another step between Drach'nyan and the Emperor, another day that the Imperium endured. The sword vanished into Ra's flesh, and the custodian felt it settle inside him, like something alive and furious and patient. And the pain of it was beyond anything he had ever known, and he bore it, because that was what every vision and every truth and every moment of his life had been leading toward. The Emperor raised his hand and conjured a beam of burning golden light that blazed down the tunnel ahead, searing the darkness back, clearing a path through the webway that stretched into the impossible distance. And he gave his final command. A single word, spoken to the last tribune of the Legio Custodes, the son of a woman who had been executed for stealing Terra's last ocean, a warrior who had earned 871 names in honor of valorous deeds, and who would carry none of them where he was going. Run. Ra Endymion obeyed the last order he would ever receive. He turned from his master and he ran, and the burning light carried him forward into the endless dark of the webway. And he did not look back, and no one ever saw him again. The surviving Imperials evacuated through the portal. Diocletian Koros, terse and pragmatic and carrying wounds he would not speak of. Caria Kasrin, the Oblivion Knight who had installed the coffins and seen the Emperor as he truly was. Xiphon, the bringer of sorrow, whose borrowed hands had already stopped working. Archon Land, brilliant and insufferable, clutching his cybernetic monkey. Genetia Kroll, the soulless queen, missing 3 fingers from her sword hand. The battered, diminished remnants of a force that had once been the finest the Imperium could field, stumbling back through the golden doors into the Imperial dungeon beneath the palace. The Emperor mounted the golden throne. He sealed the Webway gate, and the doors that had once opened onto humanity's future closed forever. In the silence that followed, the Emperor spoke to Diocletian, and what he said broke something in the custodian that would never fully mend. He said that his great work was ruined, that Horus had destroyed everything, that the Webway, humanity's one chance at transcending the warp, was dead, and that the Imperium, for all its vastness and all its armies, was now doomed to the same slow extinction that had consumed the Eldari. It might endure 100 years, or 1,000, or 10,000, but one day it would fall, because the shining path was gone and nothing could replace it. Diocletian, who had fought for 5 years in the dark, who had watched 9,000 of his brothers die, who had brought the condemned and the broken into the tunnels, and watched them die too, asked the only question he could think of. He asked what he should do, what any of them should do now, with the dream dead and the future foreclosed, and the Imperium reduced to a thing that existed only to delay an ending that could no longer be prevented. The Emperor turned away into the darkness, and he said the words that no custodian had ever heard him speak, words that shattered the very foundation of their faith in his omniscience and his plan and his certainty. He said, "I don't know." The journal ends there, or nearly there, a few lines more, written in a hand that trembles slightly, the letters smaller and closer together, as though the author were running out of either space or courage. 10,000 years, the journal says. 10,000 years of slow decay on a throne that was never meant to be a prison, in an imperium that was never meant to be an end in itself. Every psyker fed to the golden throne since that day, every soul that burned in the coffins beneath the palace, every prayer screamed into a void that has never once answered. All of it traces its origin to this war, fought in the dark beneath a mountain, in tunnels that the galaxy will never know existed. The shining path was destroyed. The species that was supposed to walk it will never know how close it came, will never understand that it was one completed project away from something that might, in time, have resembled godhood. They will live and fight and die in an imperium built on the ruins of a dream they were never told about, sustained by a sacrifice they will never comprehend, governed by a corpse on a golden chair who once held the future in his hands and watched it burn. And somewhere in the Webway, in the endless dark beyond the sealed gate, a golden warrior is still running, carrying the echo of humanity's first murder as far from the light as his legs will take him, obeying the last command he will ever receive, faithful to the end and beyond it. That is the story. That is what was lost. And the clerk in the archive closes the journal and sits for a long time in the cold, and does not know what to do either.